Susan Winebrenner, author of Teaching Gifted Kids in Today's Classroom. And the third edition was co-authored by my colleague, Dr. DINA BRULLES. I want to spend some time with you in these video sections showing you how we can identify and serve gifted students in what used to be called regular classrooms. The whole field of gifted education is changing dramatically. Pull-out programs, which have been extremely popular in the 20th century, are being phased out, and what's being phased in is the grouping of these kids in the regular classroom. But if the teachers who have these students in their classrooms have not had training, it would be very hard for them to provide what the parents consider to be adequate interventions. So even identification has gotten much less formal. In many states, they don't even ask you to formally identify gifted students because they don't provide any resources or money for those programs. In many other states, they still do have a viable and useful method for identifying gifted students. Even the term gifted is on its way out, which I think is terrific because it caused so many problems of its own that interfered with providing the right opportunities for these advanced learners. We are replacing it with exceptionally capable, highly capable learners, or advanced learners. So in terms of identification, if you do have access and are expected to use certain identification methods, please do. But if you don't, we are actually encouraging you to notice advanced learners by their behaviors and learning capacities in the classroom. In chapter 1 of this book, there's a lot of information about characteristics of gifted learners, and they are all-inclusive of atypical gifted learners, such as non-productive gifted learners, such as young gifted learners, such as gifted learners that don't speak English fluently, such as gifted learners from poverty, and all the information you need to notice some kids who have this capacity but who may or may not have been formally identified in the past will be helpful to you. The other thing you should know is that my style of differentiating for these kids is to offer the opportunity for all kids, to all kids, explain the option for the whole class. And if some kids who've never been identified as gifted want to try to demonstrate previous mastery, let them do it, because whether they are successful or not will speak much louder volumes to them than whether you deign to decide whether or not they should be able to access this method. So we rely on teacher nomination, but when we compare teacher nomination to parent nomination, something really interesting happens. Some years ago, there was a study done in a kindergarten classroom. The authors were trying to ascertain which group of people were more likely to identify correctly gifted or advanced learners. So parents who were invited to volunteer for 1 full week in that classroom. And at the end of the week, they were given a class list and simply asked to check the names of the kids that they thought were gifted or advanced. They gave the teacher a year to learn that information. And at the end of the year, the teachers were given the same survey that had been given to parents. Take a moment to decide which group, teachers or parents, do you think more accurately identified which kids were gifted? Because at the end of that school year, every single kindergartner was tested by a trained psychologist for an IQ score. The parents' score was near 65% accuracy when their list was compared to the tests from the psychologist. Fewer than 20% of the teachers were accurate in their identification, and that's because teachers who have never had any gifted education training tend to identify as gifted kids who resemble the perfect student. And that is only a very small view or judgment to find out which kids are advanced learners. So we want you to be open to understanding that the gifted kids in your class may never have been identified formally, may have been in gifted programs in earlier grades and no more. But my style is when you know what strategy you want to use to determine a student's prior knowledge, you just explain it to the whole class. And anybody who wants to do the activity you've designed to show you that they already have mastered this should be allowed to do it, whether or not they have ever been formally labeled as gifted. Are gifted kids always good students? Not at all. Some of them choose to conform and excel, and they get a lot of pleasure from that. Some kids in the upper grades and in middle and high school often try to hide their advanced learning capacity because they have experiences which teach them that it's not safe to let other kids know how smart you are. And so they hide behind behaviors that are not so smart or gifted. If you have what you call the class clown, the kid who blurts out something that makes the whole class dissolve in laughter, you have to take another look at that kid. Because anybody who can make a group of people laugh by what they said, not by silly actions or sounds, should be considered to be an advanced learner. How do we think it feels to be labeled gifted or advanced? We would assume that it's a wonderful experience, but actually for many kids it's not. They start out with being very proud and having been identified because their parents often are very proud. And they called relatives and friends to make the announcement, she got in. And that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on these kids. But later on, the pride that they felt often turns to anxiety as they have to make consistent choices about whether or not to show this advanced capacity. And the more a student tries to deny their advanced capacity, the less likely they are to be productive in that way. So as they get older, they are plagued by this question, what happens when people find out I'm supposed to be smart? And they are struggling with that against their desire to be accepted as a member of their age group, and that creates a tremendous amount of stress for them. So, in terms of identifying gifted students, perfectionism is the elephant in the room. I firmly believe that every problematic behavior that advanced learners experience is directly connected to their understanding or assumption that once they have this label, people pretty much expect them to be gifted across the board. That is, as advanced in one area of learning as in any area of learning. That is a fallacy. If you have a student who's a gifted musician, but who doesn't really do very well in academic subjects, would you say, well, he's not truly gifted because he doesn't have these capacities in all areas of learning? Not true, it's a fallacy. So we look at each area of learning or each subject area that we're teaching, and we try to find kids who shine by thinking more deeply and at higher levels than their age peers, and we look harder at those kids to see how we can nurture their advanced learning capacity. Many authors have written about the complaints that gifted kids have, and there are books at Free Spirit Publishing about that topic, written mostly by Judy Galbraith, who's the president, and Jim DeLisle, that help you go inside the minds of gifted kids of all ages. And they have documented some typical gripes, things that gifted kids wish were different, such as they don't like to be teased about being smart, and such as, I'm always worried about world problems and nobody else at school seems to care, such as the perfection expectations from people who know you have that label. And all of those things are very difficult for these kids to cope with, and that resource and others at Free Spirit will help you understand these kids dramatically better. The last thing I want to talk about here is, why is it that some gifted kids have no trouble with that label and are happy to continue accepting the label as they move along in the grades, and other kids come to a screeching halt in terms of their willingness to attach to the label at about adolescence? Now, we know that that happens. And these kids, as they enter middle school, will say to their parents, listen, I don't want to do that gifted thing anymore. And the parents say, why not? You used to love it. I just don't want to do it anymore. What they don't realize is happening, and why they're saying that, is because they have perceived that age peers will not accept them as a regular kid if indeed they carry that label with them through school. Much of that is connected to the penchant of American adults to value this label to the point of bragging about it. And that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on these kids. So we now follow the work of Dr. Carol DWECK to help us understand why some kids are always open to new learning challenges, and other kids resist them like crazy because they're afraid that they'll be asked a question that they cannot answer. Her work on fixed and growth mindsets is mind-boggling. And she has some fabulous videos available free on YouTube. I'm telling you, you'll never be the same teacher or parent again after you see that. Because when we focus on praising the kid for the smarts, or when we focus on praising what we consider to be excellent work, these kids become addicted to that praise. And they're afraid if that praise goes away, they won't be considered smart anymore. So I'm glad that you could join us today, and the next video section will focus on specific things that you can do with advanced learners of all ages to keep them occupied and happy and productive in school. Thanks very much.